everyone. We are very excited to be here today and present you the contents of the Research Highlights session. Dr. Maxine Chiran and myself, Dr. Maria Peters, are chairing the moderation of this session, which has been divided in 3 parts. There are topics related to swine production, swine bacteriology, and swine virology, as well as some nutritional aspects of swine production. So with that, I will start with the introduction of our first speaker, and this is Dr. Fernando Bortolozzo. Dr. Bortolozzo obtained his DVM degree from the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul in Brazil, and he obtained a doctorate in Hanover, Germany, on physiopathology of animal reproduction. His focus these days is on swine reproduction and management. He's a full professor at the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul. He has more than 26 years of experience in research, and he works with a group of more than 30 undergraduate and graduate students. With that, thanks, and let's listen to Dr. Bortolozzo.
Hi, good afternoon to everybody. First of all, I'd like to thank you for the invitation to be here today at Leman Conference. It's a great pleasure for me to talk to you. And our work together will be about the impact of weaning age on pig performance in a commercial multisite production. I'm from south of Brazil, from the southernmost state of the country, and I work here for a federal university located in Porto Alegre. And as you might know, the pig production in Brazil is concentrated here in this area. We have 2/3 from our production here in these 3 states in south of Brazil. This is the agenda of my presentation today. In this first point here, I would like to talk about weaning age in a commercial multisite production system, then a little bit about weaning age and creep feeding, and at the end, weaning age and some challenges that we have in this area. From the background information, we have a lot of data using ages below 21 days. The questions today is how weaning age maximize profitability, especially with our current challenges in a multi-site production system above 21 days of age. Well, on that, I would like to share with you this trial that we published recently. It is part of the PhD work from our student, Jamil Fassin. In this trial, we wean the animals in 4 ages, but we wean on the same age, as you can see here in the picture. Then we follow the groups in the nursery and also later on a finisher. Here you have a picture of our research facility inside of this farm, is the nursery. In this nursery, we had 14 replications per treatment, okay? Later on, in a finisher, you have a picture here of the finisher facility. In this part of the trial, we had 10 replications per treatment. Then moving to the results of this trial, you can see here the body weight of the animals at weaning and at the end of the nursery. In both situations, we had a linear effect, increasing the weight of the animals when we increased weaning age. You can see here the pictures of average daily gain, average daily feed intake, and feed efficiency during the nursery period. You can see here a linear effect on average daily gain, average daily feed intake, increasing weaning age. We were able to increase these both variables, and we had a tendency for a linear effect on feed efficiency. interesting to point out also is that the percentage of pigs that lost weight during the first week in the nursery. We had a linear effect here, as you can see, with a higher percentage of animals losing weight when we had younger ages. In this picture, you see the percentage of animals on the left, percentage of removals also with a linear effect, and we had no differences on mortality during the nursery period. In the finisher, you can see here on the left, the average daily gain with a linear effect increasing with the increase of weaning age. But as I told you, we also weight the animals on the same age at the very end of the period. And when we weight the animals at the same age, and we took in consideration the lifetime average daily gain from birth up to this age here, we saw no differences on average daily gain, lifetime average daily gain. Here you can see the body weight of the animals at 136 days after weaning. We saw a linear effect, but when we took the age, the same age, we saw no effect at all on body weight. Also during the finisher, we saw no effect on the percentage of removals and mortality. This is an interesting picture. You can see the weight sold per pig weaned. You can see here a linear effect when we increase the weight sold per pig weaned when we increase the weaning age. Moving to the second trial, in this trial, it was part of the master of Luciane Hernich. She did a 2x2 factorial trial with weaning age, 21-25 days, use or not of crib feeding. You see here a picture of the feeder, and here you can see where we place the feeder inside the fairing crate, okay? As I told you, as we did before, we wean the animals on the same day, 2 ages, yeah? And we gave the crib feeding 10 days before we wean the animals. Moving to the results, before that, I'd like to show you the research facility is the same one that we used in the first experiment. And here we had 7 replications per group. First results that I would like to share with you is the percentage of eaters during lactation. We can see that we were able to increase the percentage of eater, increasing weaning age, but the percentage of eaters that we had in these trials is not so good as in other trials from other groups. I mean, the percentage, even here with 25 days, is not so good at all. You can see here the crib feeding intake based on feed disappearance. You can see that we increase the crib feeding intake when we increase the age, the weaning age. About the weight, you can see here the weight of the animals at weaning. We had an effect of age, but no effect of crib during at weaning, okay? And no interactions at all. At the end of the nursery, 6 weeks in the nursery, we had an effect of age, comparing here on the left in red, 21 days of weaning age, and compared to 25 days of weaning age. And we had a tendency of an effect for crib feeding use. Here you can see from 21 and from 25 days of age, and no interactions. The last trial that I would like to share with you today is about the challenges. In this trial, we did, it was possible to do during the period that our PhD student stayed for a sandwich PhD at the Kansas State University. It was possible to run this trial inside of the Holden farms. And in this experiment, it was a 3x2 factorial experiment. We had 3 weaning ages and the use or not of antibiotics. You can see here we use chlorotetracycline, and you can see the treatment that was done. Replicates, we had 28 pens for weaning age and 36 replications for the use of antibiotics. So moving to the results, you can see here the body weight at weaning. We saw here a linear effect increasing weaning age. We increased the body weight at weaning. It is similar to the results that we have in our first trial that I showed to you. And the growth rate from weaning up to 197 days of age, we had a linear effect for weaning age and also an effect for antibiotic use. It increased 14 grams a day. The percentage of injectables, antibiotics used from weaning up to the end, we had a quadratic effect, as you can see here is in this picture, a quadratic effect for weaning age. Removals and mortality. We had a tendency for a linear effect for age, you can see here, and a reduction in removals and mortality when we use antibiotics of almost 3%. Sorry. This is my last picture from this trial. You can see here the weight sold per pig weaned. You can see that it was possible to observe a linear effect for weaning age and also an effect for the use of antibiotics. I mean, it was possible to increase in almost 5 kilograms per weight sold per pig weaned. Well, I'm going to my take-home messages. From the first trial, I would like to point out three points. The first one, weaning age impacts on nursery survivability and performance. The second, weaning age influences the percentage of pigs that reach market weight. And the third point that we observed is that it was possible to maximize the weight sold per weaned pig when the pigs were weaned at 25 days of age. From the second trial, crib feeding and weaning age, actually we have more answers than, more questions than answers. The percentage of eaters was not so good in our trial. Perhaps we should take a look on the feeder, also on the feed, and especially we waited for an interaction between weaning age and the use of crib feeding, and we did not observe that. As I told you, more questions than answers. I think that we might work a little bit more in this situation, weaning age and the use of crib feeding. And in the last trial, we expected an interaction between weaning age and antibiotic use, and we saw no interactions. Pigs weaned at 24.5 days of age, they required less injectable antibiotics. And at the end, increasing weaning age and a relatively short term of antibiotic maximize the weight sold per weaned pig. Well, with that, I would like to acknowledge the people involved in our trial, the professors here at the university, also our students. I'd like to thank also the professors at Kansas State University, our industry partners here in Brazil. Master is a family company here in South. They are our great partners in our trials. Agroceres PIC, and in US, Holding Farms. I would like to thank also the support from our National Council for Scientific and Technological Development that granted the first two trials, and also the funding for a scholarship from this Brazilian agency, CAPS. And at the end, thank you very much for your attention. I would like to thank also all the students that are involved in our group that really do the job. So thanks again.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bortolozzo, for that presentation. Now we move on to our next speaker, who is Mark Schwartz. Mark obtained his degree in animal science at the University of Minnesota and is currently pursuing a master's degree at the University of Minnesota as well. Mark is the director of production systems at Schwartz Farms. He's responsible for the operational management of all the swan farrowing facilities, and he's also making sure that there is a seamless integration of production systems between farrowing and wean to finish operations. So with that, let's welcome Mark.
Good afternoon. It is a pleasure to be able to share some thoughts and ideas this afternoon with you. My topic today is the initial analysis of a novel production model used in the farrowing house, and a bit of background is necessary on this topic. Litter size has increased year over year through the genetic selection and a great job by the genetic companies in helping us increase productivity and efficiency with larger litter size, measured in both total born and live born. The other consequence of this is pre-wean mortality has increased also. And so the number of pigs weaned per litter has increased, but not proportionally to the increase in live born pigs. The farrowing crate design really has remained little changed in the last 20 to 25 years. Typically a 5 foot by 7 foot or 1.5 by 2.1 meter farrowing crate total area. Some newer construction in the mid 2000s and later would allow for a 7 or 5.5 by 7.5 foot crate with one heat lamp and one heat mat per crate. Typically 125 watt heat bulb with a approximately 13 inch by 26 inch creep mat. And so what we know is that litter size continues to the upward trend. The limiting factor to increased weaned pigs per sow is the number of functional teats not live born. Early intervention and piglet care has contributed to decreased mortality. However, mortality from late-on pigs continues to be a substantial proportion of the total mortality, and little change in design has occurred over time, and also applied research in this area is very limited. And so a data set just illustrating that although we've worked hard on intense and focused early pig care to reduce starve-out pigs and pigs that are not receiving sufficient nutrition and energy, but mortality remains little changed through that. It's improved, but a driver of this mortality is late on pigs, as this graphic illustrates. It's another way to look at it from a data set is that in the first 2 days, about 60% of mortality is from Leman, and another 20% approximately from 3 to 6 days, and still 15 and 7% from 1 to 2 weeks of age and 2 weeks and greater, respectively. So what has led to this concept is called MSCC, or multi-suckle common creep model. As I was working on this and looking for ideas to improve our system, was frustration with pre-wean mortality levels that were little changed after implementing extended care in farrowing. So we're having people attending close to 100% of farrowings to be there to dry off the pigs. And we've worked hard on additional training for the day one caretakers, training to be able to align the number of pigs in a litter with the number of teats, looking at how many pigs the sow had weaned in previous lactations, looking at parity identification, understanding which parity sows would most likely be able to wean a greater number of pigs, and working on split suckling. And through all that, pre-wean mortality, as I mentioned, has remained elevated from previous time periods. And we've worked on hoovers and other interventions and used those and evaluated it. So what is called MSCC, or multi-suckle common creep, was a concept that thought about and theorized about, but was hesitant to try because it's not something that's been used anywhere else. And so about 1 year ago, decided to use a limited application using 1/2 of farrowing room to have blocks of treatment and control in order to collect data and make observations. And so to see this in action on the video is this is a room of 48 farrowing crates in which 12 litters are allowed to have a common creep area in the center of what was the alleyway. As soon as possible after the litter has been born and has nursed from the birth sow and has received the supplemental iron injection, at that point the creep dividers are pulled and the pigs are allowed to lay in front of the crate instead of on the side, which is the traditional method. And so what you're seeing is 12 litters combined. We've moved some rooms to 24 litters in one group and found no disadvantage. And so the flooring in the middle had to be adapted. As we were first exploring this, we used temporary plywood that was raised up on 2x4 on edge to get the front creep area at the same level as the flooring in the crate. As a pig at 6 hours to a day of age would not be able to step up and down that lip down to the floor. So underneath the flooring now, we've decided on this farm to invest in permanent flooring in this decking. So it's a plastic coated expanded metal, and underneath that is solid concrete. So there's solid underneath this area. There's no drafting underneath. And we're allowed to create multiple comfort zones instead of just one, and the pigs choose their laying areas in this model. And so that's the system in that we're still working on, but this is the basic concept of it. So what is MSCC? Providing a common creep area for, on this farm, either 8, 12, or 24 litters in the front of the crate. It's opening up the creep dividers, the fronts and sides, as soon as adjacent litters have farrowed, and after having obtained colostrum from the birth sow, and in our system, after having received the iron injection. It provides multiple comfort zones with heat lamps and mats located in the front creep area. There's solid flooring underneath the raised decking for minimal drafting, and it's increased space. So approximately on this farm, 7.5 additional square feet per litter, or 0.7 additional square meters per litter. Also, a feature of the system is after the entire group has been opened up, then 4 to 6 crates are then made as a group, and depending on the number of smaller pigs, and those smaller pigs are moved into that subpopulation. So for 48 crates, there's 4 to 6 that are reserved for the smaller pigs. We call these the critical care litters, just for improved competition based on size. And so this method has been working well to improve our productivity, which I'll show the numbers in just a bit. How do we know that multi-suckling is occurring? In this picture, a number of months ago, I was doing a genetic trial in which 2 different sire lions were being evaluated, and at birth, the pigs were tagged either with a green or yellow ear tag, and then weighed prior to opening up. And within 30 minutes of having opened up the creep area, as you can see in this photo, pigs obviously from different litters had chosen different sows, and as they do, nurse across multiple sows any given day. How do we know that common creep is occurring? Well, obviously, just as you saw in the video, the pigs are allowed to have their creep area in one common large area. So very preliminary data on this system. This was collected in September and October of 2019, when the rooms were set up with 1/2 conventional and 1/2 multi-suckle common creep. And we were attaining some extremely good numbers during this time period in general. And so some of these numbers are, because of the parity and the age of the sow herd, would not be typical, but consistently we saw a reduction in pre-wean mortality at 5.2 compared to 9%, 10.7 versus 11.4, 4.7 versus 8, and 6 versus approximately 10%. That reduction is due to the reduction in crushing or laid-on pigs. I was able to obtain a wean weight sample between the treatment groups on 2 occasions, and we'll do more in more detail in the upcoming months. But on 2 weigh periods, I had advantage to the multi-suckle common creep model of 12 pounds compared to 10.3 and 12 compared to 10.5 pound average wean weight. Was able to look at this and do a statistical analysis, and it was significant statistically also. I was able to obtain end of nursery weights on one group obtained from another farm in which we just did a very small subsample within that population in the farrowing house itself, but did obtain end of nursery weights and showed an advantage to the pigs raised in the multi-suckle common creep model of 42.9 pounds compared to 38.8 pound average end of nursery weight. So in addition to the productivity enhancement, I believe there's other implications and possible benefits of this production model. And these will be explored in the upcoming months through additional study. When there's 2 populations of pigs, for example, being weaned compared to 48 populations of pigs in the individual crates, what are the implications of the transmission, for example, of influenza across those populations when those pigs are nursing from the sow prior to weaning? Could we get homogenization of influenza, for example, strep suis, Glasserella parasuis, Actinobacillus suis, Mycoplasma hyarinus? What are the implications of the possible homogenization across that population prior to weaning and not at the time or post-weaning when other stressors are occurring. Another advantage in one of the other drivers of this is to be able to extend wean age. In the conventional farrowing crate, it's very difficult with today's litter sizes, just due space constraint, to wean much beyond 20, 21 days. So with this method, I've also explored extending wean age out to 25, 26, 27 days without constraining growth rate across in those last days with reduced space per pig. So that is another advantage there. So there's challenges, unknowns, opportunities. Can this method be done on other farms successfully? Can it be replicated successfully? What would the adjustments have to be, for example, in a PRRS break? We went through one on this farm in last November. And how long to take to re-implement the MSCC model post-PRRS break? What are the responses to scours breaks? What happens when the parity distribution is less than optimal in a herd? Is that going to affect the system's success? There's some really amazing, I think, looking at the pigs and the numbers, the ability to optimize the gland utilization, that the pigs just let the sow do the job. And so the growth rate and the reduction of fallback pigs has some very good possibilities to improve productivity across the system. So it's a very interesting concept. There's much more work to be done. And I want to thank Dr. Maria Peters and Randall Singer and my work at the university and the farm staff at the home farm and all those at Schwartz Farms. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Dr. Schwartz. That was a wonderful presentation. I'd like to introduce to us the next speaker. Next speaker is Michaela Trudeau. Mickey is a PhD candidate here at the University of Minnesota, works with Dr. Pedro Uriola. Her MS, she's a PhD candidate. So her thesis, her master's work focused on the survival of porcine epidemic virus, PEDV, in swine feed. Mickey is currently working on her PhD in swine nutrition, and her main interests are swine health and nutrition, but for investigating alternatives to antibiotic therapy and alternative to antibiotics in nursery pigs. Okay, so we'll have Mickey talk to us about methodologies and informed evaluation of alternatives to antibiotics.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Now, I think all of us would agree that measuring growth performance is important to decide what feed additives we want to include in the diet or what interventions should be utilized on commercial farms. However, what we might not understand is the abundance of factors that will go into making these piglets healthy and efficient, including the microbiome, gut function, the environment they're in, genetics, metabolism, and immune activity. So in making decisions that will impact the growth of the animal, collecting as much of this information as possible and using it to build a mechanism of action is going to be a key component in getting the desired growth response and ultimately the profitability on a commercial farm. Now, in thinking about how trials are typically done on commercial farms, there was a really good presentation done by Dr. Terry Coffey, who was one of the keynote speakers at Leman Conference last year. And this presentation is still available to watch, so I encourage everyone to go back and check it out. But what this presentation discussed is how Smithfield in particular conducts their internal research and uses this information to implement new technologies on the farm. So one of the things that I thought was especially interesting, and it's something that we always need to keep in the back of our mind when we're conducting any type of pig trial, is the score sheet that they use to evaluate new innovations. And this score sheet really outlines the industry interest in having a high return on investment, a low cost, practical concepts, and minimal resources that need to be invested. And once again, I think that these are important pieces that we always need to keep in mind when we're evaluating our research. So having a particular focus is incredibly important when we're developing a new feed additive for the swine industry, but this can get really challenging and difficult when we start to evaluate products that work great in one barn, but don't have an effect in another barn. And unfortunately, we haven't been able to find that silver bullet solution that works perfectly in every single situation. And this is what makes it really difficult to decide when to implement a product or maybe leave it out. Now, animals have complex biological systems that are going to be different in different barns, at different ages, under different management practices, or when fed different diets. And this brings up a really good point, that until we start to understand what these additives are doing to the animal, it makes it really difficult to make any practical recommendations. Now, this complexity is demonstrated very well when we're feeding antibiotics at growth promotion doses. Now, this graph is adapted from data from Schwartz and Gabler in their 2017 review outline, and it looks at the average daily gain response and gain to feed response when an antibiotic is included in the diet. Now, this study looked at 495 different publications, and surprisingly, we see that 71% of the trials reported no response in average daily gain, and 82% of the trials reported no response in gain to feed, even when supplementing an antibiotic. And that's outlined by the tan sections in this pie chart. Now, in this example, antibiotics were used as the model. But in the same review, there was a similar pattern when evaluating 8 different categories of feed additives, indicating that this variable response is present with a lot of the other feed additives we're looking to for alternatives to antibiotics. So as we think about how we're going to evaluate these new feed additives, we need to keep in mind the complexity of the animal system. Now, in the area of animal science, we tend to be guilty of conducting a huge amount of growth performance trials, which reflect a traditional type thinking. So we feed a product or provide a treatment and weigh the animal, and if it grew better, that's great. If not, we'll just try something else. Now, don't get me wrong, these trials are very important because ultimately we want to keep in mind that our goal is to reliably improve growth, because that's our bottom line. However, as we get into these complex areas of why a product works and another product doesn't, or when we have to start making decisions about what we want to include in the diet and what could be removed, we need to start evaluating more of the entire system of the animal. Because in reality, when we're feeding a new product, there's a lot of things that are going on to determine how effective that product is. And if we only measure the treatment and the results, we're missing all of this information and interaction that's going to be helpful in deciding what product we can use and which one we maybe want to skip. So by getting a better understanding of the entire animal system, we can be smarter about what we're supplementing our animals with. And this animal system differences was highlighted very well in a recent collaboration that we had with Purina Animal Nutrition. So in this experiment, we evaluated a variety of antibiotic alternatives across 3 separate experiments. And each one of these experiments had the same negative control without an antibiotic and positive control with an antibiotic. Now, these 2 plots are both PCA plots, with the first one being colored by treatment and the second one being colored by experiment. So in reading a PCA plot, what we really want to look for is the clustering patterns between the points. And interestingly, the difference in clustering by experiment, where we have this clear cluster of orange points in the wean to finish barn, is much more apparent than any clustering that we see by treatment, where you can't really see any patterns between the black and white points in the first plot. So this tells us that the environment had a stronger impact on the microbiome than feeding an antibiotic in the diet. And this finding is really interesting and a pretty important piece of knowledge that we want to keep in mind as we continue to evaluate products, as products may perform different based on the environment that we're using them in. And currently, we don't have a lot of data from different experiments or studies that are evaluating these effects. So moving forward with future research, this is an effect that we need to study and collect more data on so we can produce products that show a repeatable effect, even when we're changing the environment. So now that we have a better understanding of what we want to accomplish with our research trials, I want to outline how this can be accomplished. So no matter where an experiment is done, there are a few must-haves that need to be included. First off, a key element to any good experiment is understanding the literature and what information is already known about that feed additive. And if there's an abundance research already available, a meta-analysis is a really good option to extract information from this data without necessarily conducting another animal trial. After thoroughly going through the literature, this information can then be used to develop your objective, which should be focused and measurable. So in addition to this, an appropriate experimental unit needs to be determined. And this can be animal, pen, or even barn, depending on what your objective is. Now, another key aspect of a good experiment is appropriate treatment randomization. And I know sometimes it can be tempting to just split a barn in half and apply a treatment to one side and a control group to another side. But this adds a lot of unintentional bias that can influence your data and not produce reliable data to use. Now, a power calculation is also necessary to determine the number of replicates that are required to detect a difference. And this step is actually really important when conducting an experiment where you're expecting only a small difference in performance, because then you may require a large number of animals to be used in that experiment. So after you determine number of replicates, you also need to determine your control treatment. And this is especially important to weed out unintentional effects. Now, one of the common mistakes that you see a lot, especially with the control treatments, is the temptation to switch pigs onto a new trial immediately after one trial has finished to produce data quickly and also minimize the number of animals that you use. And while this is acceptable, it's important to have a washout period to make sure that the animals aren't being influenced by a previous treatment from your experiment before. And the control group is going to be really key for this reason, because if your control pigs aren't producing the response you're expecting them to produce, then there might be a problem with your experimental design. Now, the last point I want to emphasize is conducting an experiment in multiple barns. So as we observed earlier, there's a significant impact on experiment location. And with this added inherent variability, we need to be testing products in many locations to make sure that we're making a conclusion about the product and not just the location that we did the experiment. Now, moving into the potential outcome, these measurable outcomes will likely depend on the resources available at the farm site. And when considering the economically driven goals of our industry partners, it's essential to consider growth and health outcomes, because that's what's going to affect their bottom line. On the growth side, these parameters can include average daily gain, feed intake, gain to feed ratios, but it's also important to study the body weight distribution, as this is going to play an important role in determining when the animals can be shipped or the number of low quality animals that you might have in the barn. Now, in addition to growth, health measurements are also going to impact profitability, as mortality, morbidity, and the magnitude and direction of these responses is going to increase cost and labor that's associated with the barn. Now, even though growth and health are heavily emphasized when making decisions on the farm, I think it's also important to consider the possibilities of a microbiome or a metabolome analysis, even in a commercial farm setting. Now, these analyses can both easily be done on fecal samples that are relatively easy to collect, even on a commercial farm, and it only requires about 10 samples per treatment to really gain a lot of information about the product. So previous research has shown that microbiome and metabolome are going to be connected to the growth performance of the animal. And that makes sense, because if an animal is growing better, it's because of a change in the metabolism or something that's happening inside that animal that we can't necessarily see that's helping it grow better. And if we aren't collecting this data that gives us clues on what's driving the response, then every time we have a new additive, we're going to be pulled into this cycle of testing the product in a growth performance trial over and over again in every type of situation. And when we think about the economic impact of conducting an abundance of growth performance trials that don't produce a response, it makes sense to use an experimental approach that will provide us with a lot more information about the additives we're evaluating. So for example, this is an experimental approach that we've used on quite a few experiments that we've done at the University of Minnesota, where we combine data from the microflora, the metabolome, and animal health and performance to identify different markers or models for a specific treatment that we're testing. And this can provide us with information like, did the additive significantly change the microbiome? Was it even absorbed in the intestine? Did it have an impact on a specific metabolic pathway? And this is the type of information that we can use to help us make decisions in the future when deciding on if we want to implement that product. So for a more specific example of how we use this approach, I was involved in a collaboration with Dr. Isaacson. And for this experiment, we built off of a publication they had in 2012 where they evaluated the fecal microbiome of growth finished pigs on a commercial farm who were either fed tylosin for the positive control or not fed tylosin for the positive control, and then followed for a 12-week period. We were then able to build on this analysis by completing a metabolomics analysis on these same fecal samples. So we did both the microbiome and metabolome analysis, but we saw a very similar trend. And so for the sake of time, I'm just going to discuss this metabolomics piece that's presented here. So in looking at this PCA plot, it's apparent that the groups cluster by time point, with 10-week, 13-week, 16-week, 19-week, and 22-week time points clustered together. And this tells us that the greatest difference in the metabolites was by time. However, when we look at the separation between the control and tylosin group at each time point, we see the greatest separation in 13, 16, and 19 weeks, where at 10 weeks and 22 weeks, the treatments were fairly similar. So if this antibiotic was a commercial product that we were testing, this information would tell us that the product had an effect on both the microbiome and the metabolome, but it only lasted 9 weeks, and there was no differences in parameters after that. So this means that supplementing the product longer will have a diminishing impact, and the supplement can probably be removed from the diet after this 9-week period. So when we're thinking about these results and new approaches we can use to evaluate feed additives, I found this quote by Leonardo da Vinci that does a really good job summarizing the complexity of this situation. And that is, realize that everything connects to everything else. So when we think about developing feed additives that are going to continue to promote health and growth in our animals, we need to keep in mind that designing a product to have one specific effect, such as improving growth, is likely going to impact and involve multiple other animal systems. Now, before I wrap up this presentation, I wanted to give a few final take-home messages to summarize the main points I discussed today. So first of all, mechanistic-based measurements and commercial trials can be integrated and to help us make economic decisions. And this type of experimental approach is essential to collect enough information that we can use to make decisions on how or when we're going to utilize feed additives. Second, to conduct these experiments, there needs to be a thorough understanding of the literature, and an appropriate experimental design is an essential piece to getting unbiased and useful information that we can use to make these decisions. So I appreciate the opportunity to share these ideas at Leman Conference, and if anyone has any questions, feel free to reach out to me after the conference using the following email.
Mickey, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. Now I'd like to introduce our next speaker. Our next speaker is Marianna Boscato. Marianna comes to us from Holden Farms, earned her veterinary degree in swine reproductive physiology from the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul in Brazil, and her PhD in applied swine nutrition from the Kansas State University. Currently, Marianna is a swine nutritionalist at the Holden Farms, and Marianna is going to talk to us about face feeding. Do fewer faces compromise growth performance in grow finished pigs?
So good afternoon. I'm happy to share today some of the research I conducted during my PhD at Kansas State, looking at face feeding in the grow finish. So face feeding is the strategy of feeding multiple diets throughout the grow finish period as an attempt to closely meet the biological requirement of the pigs, as represented here in this lysine requirement curve, and also to minimize the supply of lysine either in excess or in deficiency. However, in practice, what we see is a large within lot and between lot variation in pig growth rate, pig intake, and pig weight, which actually increases the variation in the lysine requirement estimate in the population, as you can see by these different color curves. So typically, commercial face feeding programs attempt to closely meet those requirements for most of the population. And when we have a fewer number of dietary phases, typically we provide lysine levels below the requirement initially, and then rely on compensatory growth later on when lysine levels are adequate. And during this period of compensatory growth, pigs utilize lysine more efficiently. So the simplification of face feeding programs to fewer dietary phases not only allows for compensatory growth to be exploited, but also improves the logistics of feed manufacture, delivery, and storage associated with feeding fewer diets in the system. So we conducted a series of research trials to understand whether we could simplify phase feeding programs to fewer diets without compromising the growth performance of grow-finished pigs. So we conducted 4 research trials under commercial conditions using approximately 1,100 PAC pigs per experiment from 27 to 127 kilograms of body weight. And we housed 25 to 27 mixed gender pigs per pen and had 11 pens per treatment in each trial. Pigs were fed diets based on corn, soybean meal, and distillers, and all nutrients except for lysine, which was our test nutrient, either met or exceeded the NRC 2012 recommendations. For treatment, we had different feeding programs based on different lysine specifications and also different number of dietary phases. So for lysine specifications, we use different percentages of the estimated lysine requirements for maximum growth rate, which was 100%, 98 or 96% of the estimated lysine requirements according to the genetic supplier. And for the number of dietary phases, we fed either 1, 2, 3, or 4 phase feeding programs. For the 1 phase feeding program, we fed 1 single diet throughout the entire grow finish period. For the 2 phase feeding program, we fed initially a longer phase up to 100 kilograms of body weight and then a subsequent shorter phase. For the 3 phase feeding program, we fed an initial phase and then a longer second phase from 50 to 100 kilograms of body weight and then a subsequent third phase. And in a subsequent trial, we also tested a different 3-phase design in which we had a longer initial phase up to 70 kilograms and then 2 subsequent phases. And for the 4-phase feeding trial, we spaced the 4 phases evenly at 25 kilograms increment. So moving on to experiment 1, in this first trial, we were interested in looking at different phase feeding strategies, so comparing the 2-phase versus the 4-phase feeding program with lysine set at the requirement. And we were also interested in looking at different lysine specifications, so comparing the 4-phase feeding program with lysine at the requirements versus below the requirement versus a combination of lysine levels below the requirement initially in early grower, and then at the requirement later on in late finishing. So what we observed for overall average daily gain was that feeding either a 2 or a 4-phase feeding program with lysine at the requirement resulted in similar overall average daily gain. Feeding lysine levels below the requirement compromised overall average daily gain unless we were able to increase the lysine levels in late finishing at the requirement to really come up to a similar overall average daily gain to the other phase feeding strategies. For the relative average daily gain, we compared all phase feeding strategies to the 4-phase feeding strategy with lysine at the requirement. And we observed that for the 2-phase feeding program, as well as the 4-phase feeding program with lysine slightly below the requirement early on, we noticed this improvement in average daily gain following a period of growth restriction. And this is suggestive of compensatory growth. However, when we feed lysine levels below the requirement throughout the entire grow finish period, we do not see any evidence for compensatory growth. So in summary, for this first experiment, we observed that it is possible to feed either a 2 or a 4-phase feeding program when we use lysine at the requirement and achieve a similar growth performance. However, when we feed lysine levels below the requirements for the entire grow finish period, we compromise performance unless we increase the lysine levels to the estimated requirement in late finishing. So for experiment 2, we decided to explore more the number of dietary phases. So we compared 1, 2, 3, or 4-phase feeding programs, and all utilizing lysine set at the estimated requirement. For overall average daily gain, we observed that feeding 1 single phase throughout the growth finish period compromised overall average daily gain compared to the multiple phase feeding strategies. But feeding either 2, 3, or 4 phases resulted in similar overall average daily gain when lysine was set at the requirement. Looking at relative average daily gain, we compared every phase feeding strategy to the 4-phase feeding strategy with lysine at the requirement. And we observed for the 1-phase feeding strategy that there is a severe reduction in average daily gain early on when lysine levels are below the requirement. And there is a subsequent improvement in average daily gain, which is suggestive of compensatory growth, but unfortunately was not enough to recover the overall performance. For the 2-phase feeding strategy, we notice a similar pattern as in experiment 1, where we see this improvement in average daily gain following a period of growth restriction. But interestingly, we did not see any evidence for compensatory growth in the 3-phase feeding program. So in summary, for this second experiment, we observed that indeed feeding multiple phases is important for growth performance compared to feeding a single dietary phase. But it is possible to simplify phase feeding strategies from 4 to 3 or 2 diets using lysine levels at the estimated requirement. So with that in mind, we decided to develop experiment 3, which was very similarly designed as experiment 2, using 1, 2, 3, or 4 phase feeding programs. But this time we were interested in looking whether we could reduce the lysine levels to 98% of the estimated requirements. So for overall average daily gain, we observed that feeding a single dietary phase reduced overall average daily gain compared to a 4-phase feeding program with lysine slightly below the requirements. And this was very similar to what we observed in experiment 2. However, in this trial that we used lysine level slightly below the requirement, now we also noticed that the 2- and 3-phase feeding programs resulted in an intermediate overall average daily gain. For feed efficiency, we observed that the single-phase feeding strategy or the 2-phase or 3-phase feeding strategies all reduced overall feed efficiency compared to a 4-phase feeding strategy when we're using lysine below the estimated requirements. For the relative average daily gain, again, we compared all phase feeding strategies to the 4-phase feeding strategy. And similar to experiment 2, we observed that the single-phase feeding strategy have this very severe decrease in average daily gain early on, and it does catch up on the subsequent phases, but this again was not enough to recover the overall performance. Interestingly, in this experiment using lysine below the estimated requirement, we did not see evidence of that improvement in average daily gain following a period of growth restriction in the 2-phase feeding program. And therefore, we did not see any evidence for compensatory growth in the 2-phase program or the 3-phase feeding program with lysine below the requirement. So in summary, for experiment 3, what we observed was that, again, phase feeding strategies do provide advantage over a single dietary phase. But in this case, when using lysine levels below their estimated requirement, reducing the number of phases from 4 to 3 or 2 also compromise a little bit of the overall performance. So our goal on experiment 4 was trying to understand what was driving this negative response when we reduced the number of phases and used lysine levels slightly below the requirements. So to do that, we kept the 2-phase feeding programs that we had before, the 2-phase and the 4-phase feeding program. And then we had 2 different alternatives. The first one was to increase lysine levels in the 2nd phase to the estimated requirement, and our hypothesis was to provide more lysine levels to stimulate compensatory growth. And the second alternative was increasing the initial phase in the 3-phase feeding program to give more time later on, because our hypothesis was that more time is needed for compensatory growth to occur. And indeed, when we look at overall average daily gain, our hypotheses were correct. We observed no evidence for difference in average daily gain across the 4 phase feeding strategies. And looking at the relative average daily gain, comparing all phase feeding strategies to the 4 phase at lysing is likely below the requirements, we observe that in all cases we see this improvement in average daily gain following a period of growth restriction. And this is what we are hypothesizing that probably is driving this similar overall growth performance and was not seen in experiment 3. So in summary, for experiment 4, what we observed was that it is possible to simplify phase feeding strategies from 4 to 3 or 2 dietary phases, even when we have lysine levels set slightly below the requirements. However, it seems very important that we know what is the initial body weight and feeding take of those pigs in early grower to avoid a severe restriction in growth rate that may not be able to compensate later on. So in conclusion, when we look at the overall results in this series of trials, we notice that phase feeding strategies do provide advantages over feeding one single dietary phase. However, it is possible to simplify phase feeding strategies from 3 or 2 diets with lysine set either at the requirement or is likely below the requirement and achieve a similar growth rate. However, it's important that we keep in mind that those experiments and those results were from 27 to 127 kilograms of body weight. And it is important when we're simplifying phase feeding strategies that we do have an accurate estimate of the initial body weight and feeding take of especially early grower pigs, so we don't induce a very severe restriction in growth rate that will not be able to be compensated later on. And finally, we also observed some evidence of compensatory growth when we simplify phase feeding strategies, or when we use lysine levels likely below the requirements early on. So this allows for an improvement in the efficiency of production. However, it is important that for exploiting compensatory growth, we keep in mind that we cannot induce a very severe degree of lysine restriction or induce a lysine restriction for a very long period of time. And we also must provide enough time for recovery after this period of growth restriction, and also allow for the lysine levels to be closer to the requirements during this recovery. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I'll be happy to entertain any questions, and you feel free to reach out to me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Boscato, for that talk on phase feeding related to swine nutrition. So now our next presentation will be by Dr. Monique Paris-Garcia. Dr. Garcia obtained her DVM and PhD from Iowa State University, and now she's an associate professor in veterinarian and global production and animal welfare at the College of Veterinary Medicine of North Carolina State University. Today, she will be talking to us about the alternative euthanasia techniques in mature sows and boars.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak today. I appreciate being here virtually, and I'm happy to share some of the new research we've been doing evaluating alternative euthanasia methods in mature sows and boars. So when we think about animal welfare, we recognize that in order to optimize individual animal welfare, we need to be thinking about the animal all the way from birth to death. And so animal welfare is going to include much more than just the daily management and care of animals. And it's particularly important when we have animals that are compromised or require attention and need assistance if they're in pain and suffering. So when I think about animal welfare, I find euthanasia to be a very important tool that I can use to eliminate pain and suffering and improve the overall welfare outcome for an animal, especially if it's an animal that is compromised and is unlikely to recover. When we think about euthanasia in the swine industry, I think it's very important that we highlight the definition of euthanasia and how it's very different from depopulation. So for the work that we're doing today, we are focusing primarily on euthanasia, which is ending the life of an individual animal in a way that minimizes or eliminates pain and distress. Now, I know there's a lot of conversations on depopulation right now, but this work is really focusing on that day-to-day need for euthanizing compromised animals on farm. Now, I'm sure all of you are very familiar with the AVMA guidelines for euthanasia. This is going to cover euthanasia methods for all animals, and it's going to kind of categorize euthanasia methods into approved or approved with conditions or unacceptable methods. Now, for swine, we rely primarily on physical methods for euthanasia. So the use of firearms, the use of penetrating or non-penetrating captive bolt guns, depending on the size of the pig, the use of blunt force trauma, and the use of electrocution. So by far, when you start thinking about euthanasia methods performed on farm, we're going to be relying on these physical methods. There are some alternative methods that we can use. So inhaled methods like carbon dioxide are becoming more common on sow farms, particularly for pre-weaned piglets. And then we do have things like barbiturates where we can do an overdose for animals, although there's a lot of complications there as this is a controlled substance. And we know that we're going to have some carcass disposal issues. So by far with our physical methods, that's what we're going to be relying on farm. And when you start looking at the research that's been done on euthanasia in swine, the reality is the majority of these publications have focused on pre-weaned piglets or our nursery and finisher pigs. But for those of you that work with mature sows and boars, you know that we are dealing with quite a different animal here. Not only do we have different behaviors, different facilities, but when you start thinking about physical methods for euthanasia, we have some different challenges in terms of anatomical variation. So mature swine really do represent a challenging subpopulation of animals in regard to euthanasia because we see so much variation in their anatomical, their anatomy, as well as the thickness of their skull. Now, when you start looking at that from a physical method standpoint, if we're relying on a captive bolt gun or a firearm to penetrate the skull, we have to recognize that in mature sows and boars, we're going to see a much thicker skull. We're going to require a lot more depth in order to hit that brain cavity. And we oftentimes will see actually variations in what the shape of the skull looks like. So in order to be effective in proper placement, we're going to see a little bit of variation. And because of that, there is some anecdotal evidence or conversations regarding euthanasia methods being effective for our mature sows and boars. And so with that question or kind of that conversation, we lead into the objective of our work. And so our overall goals here, objective is to validate the effectiveness of alternative euthanasia methods in both anesthetized and conscious swine. And the reason that we did the anesthetized stage first is the euthanasia methods that we're using are not approved methods by the AVMA. So from an ethical standpoint, we wanted all of our animals to be unconscious and anesthetized in order to implement these particular euthanasia techniques. Now within this, we were interested in really two kinds of questions. We wanted to know the effectiveness of these methods using 2 alternative gun styles, as well as 3 different skull locations. So these are the euthanasia equipment we use. These were our gun styles. We use Jarvis equipment. The first is an inline stunner that has a 6-grain cartridge and has a maximum penetration of the bolt of around 4.5 to 5 inches. So this is considered a heavy-duty stunner. And this is going to have the maximum amount of penetration and grain cartridge that you would use commonly on a farm. The second gun that we utilized was the pistol style stunner, and this is also by Jarvis. The pistol style stunner uses a 4-grain cartridge, and it only has a 3.25 inch depth in terms of extension of that bolt. So we know already that these guns are going to be used for the same type of euthanasia technique, but that inline stunner does have a bit more power. Now on to the skull location. So in addition to those different euthanasia gun styles, we're going to look at 3 different types of treatment locations. So our first is our frontal, or that A. That's really what we consider our controlled treatment. This is where the majority or all individuals are euthanizing mature sows and boars on farm. And then we looked at a placement behind the ear as well as a temporal placement. So let's get actually into some of the data. And so this is for stage 1. So all of our animals were anesthetized before treatment was applied. We had 18 boars and 18 sows, and our goal was to try to get 600-pound plus animals. So we definitely achieved that with our boars. Our sows were a little bit lighter at around 528 pounds. Within each treatment, we had 3 boars and 3 sows. And so our treatments are going to be a combination of the gun style as well as location. So we have the inline with the frontal location, the inline with the temporal location, and then the inline with behind the ear. Our other 3 treatments were the pistol style gun with the frontal, temporal, and behind the ear. So in order for us to actually evaluate this, we not only care that the animal's rendered unconscious and that the animal experiences or achieves cardiac and respiratory arrest, but we are really interested to see kind of what the traumatic injury to the brain was for each treatment. And so in order to do that, we actually did a traumatic brain injury score. We chose 6 locations within the brain. These locations are associated with consciousness as well as the animal's ability to perceive. And then for each one of those locations, we would score that location from a score 0 to a score 2, with a score 0 being normal, a score 1 meaning some abnormalities, likely hemorrhage, and a score 2 being grossly abnormal or unrecognizable. Now for the final analysis, we took each one of those locations and then we summed the score. So in terms of results, we are looking at efficacy of each one of these treatment techniques. So our treatment's on our left, our efficacy is on our right. And if you can see, using the inline gun with the frontal, it was 100% effective for the sows and 100% effective for boars. The inline temporal was 100% effective for sows, but not effective for boars. The inline behind the ear was 100% effective for both sows and boars. And then this is where things got a little interesting. For the pistol, and the pistol with the location on frontal and a pistol location on temporal, it was not effective for either the sows or boars. So we had a 33% and a 66.7% for the frontal, and then a 33.3% for the temporal. The pistol behind the ear was 100% effective for sows, but was not for boars. And so because we have methods that are not approved by the AVMA, we did not follow through with any of the treatments if they did not achieve an 95% or greater of efficacy. And so given the small sample size and the challenges with looking at a product or looking at a treatment that has not been approved, our follow through in terms of stage 2, we did not include an inline temporal treatment for boars. We did not include the pistol frontal or the pistol temporal for either sows and boars, and we didn't include a pistol behind the ear for boars. So with that, that takes us to stage 2. So now these are all conscious animals that were restrained for their treatment. We had 14 boars and 28 sows, and within treatment now we had 7 boars per treatment and 7 sows for treatment. So just kind of as a reminder, we had the inline frontal for both sows and boars, the inline temporal for sows only, and then the inline behind the ear. And for the pistol gun, we only had behind the ear for the sows. So in regards to stage 2, all treatments were 100% effective. So all animals were rendered insensible and all animals achieved cardiac and respiratory arrest. We did have 3 situations in which we required a secondary shot, but it was due to improper placement of the gun. So we had 1 with an inline behind the ear, 1 with the temporal, and 1 with the pistol, and that was human error. So now on to the results. And so when we look at the traumatic brain injury score, so remember that score from 0 to 2, and we summed it all up, we found that the traumatic brain injury score tended to be less in boars compared to sows. So on average, we had a 0.6 score less for a boar compared to a sow, which makes sense given the anatomical variation and the thickness of that skull. In regards to gun style, we found that the inline style gun produced a greater traumatic brain injury score than the pistol style gun when using the frontal location. So we saw about a 2.8 score greater for that inline style gun compared to the pistol when we used the frontal location. We saw that the inline style gun tended to produce a greater traumatic brain injury score than the pistol in the temporal location. And then we didn't see any difference with the traumatic brain injury score between guns when we looked at behind the ear. So in our conclusions, the one thing that we need to really highlight is this was a very small sample size. It was a pilot study. But what we're looking at and what some of the trends are showing us is that the traditional and approved euthanasia methods that we have currently on farm may not be effective for mature sows and boars. When we start looking at that pistol style gun, when we look at that frontal location, there are some challenges where we're not achieving that 100% efficacy. Some of our other conclusions is that the inline style gun was more effective and produced greater traumatic brain injury score compared to the pistol style gun. So for individuals that are working with boars, maybe on a boar stud or working with heavier sows and boars, the inline style gun may be an appropriate option to provide that greater efficacy or a little bit more confidence that you're achieving that traumatic brain injury that you want. But we really need future work. We need to increase the sample size, and we need to also evaluate diverse skull shapes. And so given the small sample size that we had, there's still a lot of factors out there that can influence these results. And with that, I will take any questions, and I appreciate your time.
Very much, Monique, for that wonderful presentation. I want to thank all the speakers in this session for their great insight into pig production and all the different topics that they talked on. We will be back in the next session with more topics and more speakers. Thank you very much.